the newsagents.
Britain has a new Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps. And just to keep you up to date with what a busy chap Mr Shapps is, in the past year, he has been Secretary of State for Transport in the final days of the Johnson government, Home Secretary during the final 6 days of the Truss premiership, Secretary of State for Business from October 22 to February 23, Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero from 2023 until the present day, and now Defence Secretary. That's 5 cabinet jobs in 1 year. Oh, what expertise he must have gathered. We will be discussing that. But we're also going to be talking to Leah Williamson, the England women's football captain. She missed the whole of the World Cup because of an ACL injury, and she talks about what it felt like having to watch it all on television. But she also talks about what has happened with the Spanish team since, and the head of the Spanish FA, Luis Rubiales. It really is a compelling interview. That's still to come. Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John at Newsagents HQ, all by myself. Well, sort of all by myself, but we'll come to that in a moment. Later in the podcast, something unmissable. An interview with Leah Williamson, the England women's football captain, who obviously couldn't play a part in the World Cup because of an ACL injury that ruled her out. But she is fascinating on the women's game, on Spain, on sexism and misogyny. Really an interview not to miss. And as if that wasn't enough, on this bumper episode to mark the start of our second year of podcasting, we've also got the former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who in turn is fascinating about the royal family, Donald Trump, and what he calls Australia's worst ever export, Rupert Murdoch. That is still to come. But I'm not entirely by myself in the Newsagents HQ studio, because Lara Spirit is here from The Times. And Lara, we have had a reshuffle today. Ben Wallace has stood down, which was anticipated, and he has been replaced by Grant Shapps, who, if our calculations are correct, is on his 5th cabinet post in the past year.
Yeah, in a year. He held the post of Home Secretary, I think, for a week, not even that, almost a week. And actually, people miss that when he was in the wilderness, he was sent to the backbenchers, of course, by Liz Truss, who said there was no room in the inn for him. He was also elected, I remembered this morning, bleary-eyed at 5 a.m. when writing this email, that he'd briefly, for about half a day, been the chair of the Ukraine APPG2. So that's another one of his jobs to add to that as well. He's been a very busy man over the past year.
Does it matter that we keep getting these reshuffles of ministers? Now, obviously Ben Wallace had been there for a considerable period of time, but the fact that, 5 minutes ago, Rishi Sunak is putting out a press release saying, Grant Shapps is going to be responsible for delivering net zero and energy security. And 5 minutes later, well, that doesn't matter because we've put him in as Defence Secretary.
Yeah, it's an important question. Of course, Grant Shapps oversaw in part that transition in February, which broke up the department, obviously giving him that new role in so-called DESNES, that newly formed department. Obviously, this isn't the last reshuffle that we're even going to see probably before the next election, because Rishi Sunak will want to do a proper reorganisation of his top team ahead of the next election. It was once, not long ago, expected that would happen before the party conference season that we've got coming up in a short period of time. Actually, today was deemed the kind of so-called mini-reshuffle, so we've only seen a couple of changes. It's been a relatively self-contained shuffle of his team, seeing as we've seen, of course, the new Defence Secretary, but also moved into Grant Shapps' role, Claire Coutinho, that 2019 Tory MP, and another 2019 Tory MP moved into her role, and that's it. So we shouldn't be seeing more of that. It's a relatively mini reshuffle, but there will be another change indeed ahead. And of course, Claire Coutinho is an interesting illustration of what you said, because just last week we had the kind of so-called childcare education week. Of course, she was a minister in the education department. She was on the broadcast tour announcing changes to try and allow childminders to be able to work from home. She's been deemed a really capable minister in that department too. So I think that's an example of where that team is being, of course, shuffled around. And there is, of course, changes with policy briefs that means that people have less time in these circumstances to get used to them.
Well, let's consider the politics of it in just a moment. I just want to, we've had some political reaction, needless to say. This is a friend of the podcast, Emily Thornbury, with her reaction to Rishi Sunak's reshuffle.
Grant Shapps, we now know that Coutinho will take over energy and net zero. It's a small reshuffle, but these are Rishi Sunak loyalists. What does this tell us about his government and where it's at the moment, do you think?
I think that it doesn't matter how often they reshuffle the jobs or Rishi Sunak finds another mate to help and to give a new job to. The fact is they are just reshuffling the deck chairs. The ship is going down. They don't have any new ideas. There are so many challenges for our country and they have no plans. And we need to have a big change in this country. What we need is a Labour government.
That was Emily Thornberry speaking on Sky News. I'm just trying to think how many times I have heard reshuffling the deck chairs on the deck of the Titanic as a answer from politicians. Too many. Come on. It's time, Emily Thornberry, you minted a new way of talking about a reshuffle. You're not moving the deck chairs again, are you? Anyway, I suppose why Grant Shapps for defence? That would be my question. I know there were a lot of other people who were quietly jockeying for position and hoping that they might get the nod.
There was, and John Glenn, obviously a Sunak ally, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, was seen as a possible favourite in that role. But in the last few days, we've seen many other names added to that roster as well. I think, of course, this is a reshuffle, but it is one that was precipitated by Ben Wallace standing down. It's not that Rishi Sunak has gone about this of his complete own volition. It's driven by one of his most senior ministers wanting to leave that post. But Grant Shapps, interestingly, I think when you speak to people around Rishi Sunak, they obviously want to have the party in the best position ahead of the next election strategically. And Grant Shapps, of course, doesn't have the defence experience, like you say, as some of the others that were mentioned in that role. But he is deemed both a very effective communicator on broadcast. He's deemed a really effective kind of weaponizer of Conservative messaging. They want him out there. They want him out there fighting on the Conservative message in the next election. But he is also crucially deemed a very good backroom strategist. So he was, of course, at the forefront of Boris Johnson's successful bid. There is so much Westminster legend around.
And he was at the forefront of bringing Liz Truss down.
Well, exactly. And people will remember at Conservative conference last year, he was proudly displaying this massive new phone that had his spreadsheet on.
And he did that for the newsagents.
Did he?
Yeah.
Well, he's well known for that. And actually, in that kind of brief spell in the wilderness, he was said to have read the Robert Caro books on Lyndon Johnson, those kind of mass tomes in which numbers are supposed to be kind of at the heart of that American president. And indeed is kind of deemed in the Conservative Party to be fantastic at working out where people are and what the potential attack lines might be. And there is this kind of great, it might be myth, it might be true, but the story that MPs tell about, and it been reported that Grant Shapps had sort of held a piece of paper over to Boris Johnson before one of those MP rounds in the Conservative leadership contest to kind of suggest how many MPs might have gone for him, and it was exactly bang on. So he is understood to be very good at numbers. Of course, he's also, just a very good messenger, a very good marketer. And whether or not that has contributed to what we know about him and this kind of myth that's been created around his political acumen, I'm not so sure.
I agree with all of that. The thing that I would reflect on is that Ben Wallace has sort of stood above party politics in many ways. In this very tricky time as Defence Secretary, where you are, you're four square behind Ukraine, you are trying to persuade America to be more vocal in support, and you're trying to keep the Europeans on board. And so he kind of seemed to sort of be above politics. And yet Grant Shapps, as you've just described it, and I totally get the reasoning, wants to be the political attack dog and wants to be doing that, when there is a huge job of work to be done at the MOD at the moment.
That's true. They are both politically flexible, I would say. So Grant Shapps, of course, had a spell as Home Secretary under Liz Truss, right? He has successfully...
but blink and you miss it.
True. But Ben Wallace, okay, he stands above politics, but he did back Liz Truss eventually, and he said that she was authentic, which is, in his backing of her, which is an ever so potentially slightly coded way of saying that the running mate of Liz Truss at that time was perhaps inauthentic, but I don't know if that is what he meant. It might not be. But he was, of course, loyal to Boris Johnson. He's been very, very firm on support of Ukraine. And Grant Shapps, while he doesn't have defence experience, potentially, he has been a very vocal supporter of Ukraine. It suggests that there won't be any significant change to the party and government's policy on that, of course, his family took in a Ukrainian refugee family in Hertfordshire at the beginning of Russia's invasion. He has spoken, very loudly about wanting to support Ukraine in this respect. Of course, his successful, albeit short-lived bid for the Ukraine APPG leadership attests in part to that. So it's not that he's disinterested in defence.
APPG, you've spent too long in Westminster.
I'm sorry.
All-party parliamentary group. See, that was just shameful. If you start talking about, people will think it's a weapons system. Oh, we're giving the Ukraine the new APPG too.
It's Ajax or APPG.
Yeah, exactly. Honestly, you spent far too long in that place.
No, you're right.
And what about Claire Coutinho?
So I was trying to think about this. I was speaking to a former Labour cabinet minister about this earlier, which MPs have moved into cabinet positions faster upon their initial election than Claire Coutinho. And we could only think of Harold Wilson, the former Labour Prime Minister, and Pitt the Younger, who in 1781, I think it was, became Chancellor within a year of being first elected. So
This is Lewis Goodall style content here we're getting now.
For her to move, she was elected in 2019. She was, of course, a special advisor in the Treasury before that period. For her to move within the space of a few years to the cabinet is really extraordinary. And you remember Rishi Sunak had what we would consider a meteoric rise up the cabinet, but Claire Coutinho has done it faster, and so she becomes the first Tory MP elected in 2019 to be in the cabinet. She is an ultra loyalist. She was frequently during the election campaigns to be seen kind of beside Rishi Sunak. She's seen as a very trusted advisor to him, and has, as I've just said, been seen as somebody who, in her brief in the Education Department as Children's Minister, has been very successful. She's good on broadcast. She understands the issue, and I think it makes sense as an appointment. And she had, for a long time, been touted as one of the so-called rising stars who would be promoted come reshuffle.
And do we know when the bigger reshuffle, the more interesting reshuffle comes, which will be the last moment, presumably, before the general election?
Yes, so until about a week or so ago, you would still speak to people involved in organising party conferences who were reluctant to fully compile their guest list for events at conferences, lest the respective minister be moved out of position or changed or reshuffled. It's now going to be, we expect, after the party conferences, which some people are unhappy about because, of course, they will, Steve Barclay potentially and Therese Coffey, the health minister and environment minister among them, probably cast quite an awkward figure at conferences, seeing as they'll be giving these set piece speeches at events, but they are understood to be vulnerable in their positions come a reshuffle. Now, after the conference season, Rishi Sunak is expected to do a big shake-up of his team sometime in the winter, though we don't know exactly when, and that will compile the final team that he will seek to go to the electorate with, and that, as you say, will be the more interesting moment than what we've seen today.
OK, Lara Spirit, thank you very much indeed. We're going to be moving the deck chairs around on the good ship. Newsagents will be back without Lara Spirit, but with Leah Williamson. Welcome back, although we're trying to learn after yesterday's podcast not to say welcome back, but hello again, or something like that. Anyway, welcome back. Leah Williamson is the England women's football team captain. And last year, when she lifted the Euro Championship that England had won, she became the first captain to lift a major trophy since Bobby Moore in 1966. She then got an ACL injury, which meant that she has missed the World Cup and is still not yet playing for her team Arsenal, and hopes to be back in the new year. But in her spare time, because clearly she doesn't like doing nothing, she has written a book. And Leah, are you not busy enough that you needed to write a book as well?
I just felt like, after the Euros, the opportunity came about, and I thought maybe this is actually a really good idea. We've opened all these doors for all these young girls, and now maybe I give them, little nuggets or insight into my journey for them to then actually believe that they belong in those spaces. It's easy to say, oh, look at us now and we're doing it, but they need to believe that, and they've been taught otherwise, I believe. So
the book is, the conceit is that you've found a time machine, you go back 100 years, and women's football is banned.
Yes, yeah, pretty much actually, yeah.
And kind of, why did you choose that? Because actually you don't have to go back 100 years to find women's football banned.
Yeah. We just thought it was there's a big theme amongst my team, especially England, that we honour where we've come from and we honour those that came before us. I think it's really important to know where you come from and why we are where we are today. So I wanted to go all the way back, and the Ditko ladies, which is loosely based off of, were just so successful, and also got told no but continued anyway. They just weren't recognised for it. So it's a nice way to recognise what they did and get people talking about that, instead of just talking about the fact that we were banned and we weren't allowed to play, because people did play. It was just rebellious.
And Leah, I mean, how different do you think the atmosphere is today for young girls wanting to play football than it was for, say, you when you were 6 or 7 or 8 years old?
I just think I was met with hostility. It was always less than the positivity, but there was just people that just didn't either believe that I belonged there or kind of wait for it to just phase out. You know, like, oh, this is just a thing that she'll do for now and then she'll move on. So I think it's nowadays, if a girl says she wants to play football, you know, for a start, she can say, I want to be a footballer when I grow up. And that's actually a thing. There was footballers, but not professional, not in this country, not here. So I couldn't even say that to my school teachers, you know.
So it was just kind of thought, well, no, that's for boys, or what?
Yeah, just, and also like that we would never be as good as boys, or it was always a constant comparison, because our game wasn't established enough on its own. So nowadays you've got little girls growing up that aren't pretending to be men in the garden, they're pretending to be women because they know of us and they see us on the telly.
Look, you obviously had, after the Euros, a bad ACL injury. I wonder whether you wrote it. I wonder whether you're just not very good at doing nothing. That you need to be kept busy, that you need to have a project, and bloody hell, if I can't play football, I'll write a book. Yeah, no, it's partly that I have time, and I have time to invest into it. I think I maybe would have done it anyway, but just been a lot more tired. So it's been good to be able to dedicate some time to doing something like this. And I do think I did have that conversation with myself when I did my ACL, that I still have a job to do. I still have a role to play in the growth of the game and inspiring young girls. So this is my way. What's your reflections on ACL injuries? Because there's a lot of talk that it's a lot more prevalent in the women's game than it is the men's game. And is it something to do with the human physiology of a woman compared to a man, or is it something to do with the way that, you know, football boots are designed wrong for women than compared to men? I just wonder what your reflections are. I think the main cause is that, and there are loads of things, you know, the way that we are, you know, physically compared to a man, naturally. Our resources aren't great, so there's a lot of things to play in that as well. Women's football we don't play on the same, you know, carpets of pitches that the men play on every week. It's very different for us still because we're growing. What does that mean? So that it's like the pitches of old, where it's kind of more of a mud bath. Yeah, but we still have however many games called off a year because of rain or bad weather, whereas that would never happen in the Premier League because they have state of the art pitches and grass. You know, so if you just even look at that, and how far behind in terms of facilities and structure our game is, it's miles off. So naturally that'll contribute. But I just think that, you know, one day I was training twice a week or 3 times a week as an academy player, and then the next I was a professional footballer training every day, you know, going to tournaments, playing however many more games a year. And I just think the way boys are bred for it in their academies is physically they're bred over years to be able to deal with the load, and I just don't think that women have ever had that opportunity. So our base and our foundation is just not as strong as it could be and should be, and I hope that changes. And of course the ACL injury meant that you couldn't play in the World Cup, which was fantastic, but I just wonder how agonising it was to have to sit it out. I'd say it's probably one of the hardest times of my life, just because I felt so conflicted in myself. I wanted them to win, and I genuinely would have done anything for them to do that, and I was totally on board with it. But you have to have a bit of you as an athlete that wants to be on the pitch, otherwise we wouldn't get to the level that we get to. So I'm almost conflicted, because I'm like, why am I okay with them doing well, and why do I want them to do so well when actually I should really want to be in that team, and I should want to be involved. But I think that's testament to the environment that they've created as a team. It made it a lot easier to. I mean, what was your emotion when they came out on the pitch for the final?
Yeah, I had some tears. I think more for me at the start. They were probably more for me that there was a stage there and I hadn't quite made it. And that's my goal, to be on those stages, playing in those games. And then at the end of the game, I had more tears. But for them, I'm looking in my friends' eyes and I'm seeing how devastated they are. It's hard.
And I wonder what your feelings are towards the Spanish team. That here they've achieved it. They've achieved this amazing thing. And yet that victory is overshadowed by the head of the Spanish FA, who decides it's okay to kiss on the lips. Jenny Hermoso.
I put myself in Jenny's shoes first and foremost, and I think how sad that must be for her. Greatest sporting achievement of her life, and completely overshadowed, and will be forever, by this awful ordeal that she's now involved in. I think it's annoying. That even now, we've seen the footage, we've seen everything, that there's still a discussion going on. I think it's conditioned behaviour to kind of laugh that stuff off by women. And actually, when Jenny sat down and sat with it, she's been brave enough to report it and move forward so that this doesn't happen to anybody else, which I think is really, really brave. But I think it's disgusting. It's a result of a sexist and misogynistic environment, leading to treating people a way in which is just not appropriate.
I mean, he's got to go, but it seems to me extraordinary that he still carries on and that he's getting support.
Well, this is what I mean, and this is where I find it difficult that we've seen the footage, we've seen what happened, and we've heard her say what she said. So why do we struggle to believe her, or why is there anything in that? And I, one of my teammates said it. This isn't something that's just going to go away by saying sorry, but he hasn't even done that. So it's, when you look at it in that sense, it's, like I say, this is the inevitable result of that type of environment.
One other controversy I just want to put to you, which is there was criticism that neither Rishi Sunak nor Prince William went to Sydney for the World Cup final.
Yeah.
And there was a kind of feeling, and I certainly felt it, and I'm a big football fan, that if it had been England's men team in a World Cup final, the president of the FA and the Prime Minister would want to be associated with it. I mean, should the women have felt slightly miffed that he wasn't there?
I think it was the biggest stage that we've been on and the biggest level of support we've received, and I know the girls, and Prince William, he's visited us countless times to show his support and really get to know the girls and actually have conversations. So I know they feel supported by him. I don't think they would have been at all. I mean, they would have been focused on the game. I think it was us that were talking about it outside of the camp. But I don't think that they felt ignored or such by him.
Do you think for your teammates in the England team, it will be difficult to pick yourself back up after what must have been a crushing disappointment that you've got to the final? You are so close to touching the prize, and yet it doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how you fare up after it. It's also the same if you think about the Euros and winning it and then having to upkeep that level of performance. So to miss out on it can sometimes be easier to follow on with because you're still chasing that dream. But to see they were devastated, and so they should be. They've worked so hard for something that they're so close to, and it just hasn't happened.
Can I ask you something else about my? This is my reflections on watching the women's game and watching the men's game. I should declare an interest. I'm a Tottenham season ticket holder. Which
so is my dad. You're all right.
Oh, is that right? Oh, good for your dad. So he has to cheer Arsenal.
He's never ever said the word Arsenal. Only ever come on Reds.
That's a very elegant way of doing it.
Yeah.
I was struck by the men's game. You still got the racist chants. There is not a single Premier League footballer playing today who is openly gay, and you just look at the statistics of that and you think, well, that's impossible. There must be some gay players that are on the pitch every Saturday, and no one is out there. In the women's game, it's a non-issue. Why is it?
I think the environment that we've created in women's football is, you've got to imagine we've had, it's kind of this fighting spirit. We're trying to, even the fans that used to come to the games and how it started out, were there for the love of the game and the appreciation of the players. And I'm not saying that that's not the case in the men's game, but to ask a man to be openly gay in that environment, and it is hostile, you hear the things chanted from the stands, is asking him to, he'd have to be the bravest person alive, I believe, because he would receive constant hate, especially with the start of social media. And I just think the women's game is always, the reason that it's a non-issue is because when it started, there was a respect for the players and a respect that these are human beings trying to do their best. And everyone was in this, I feel like, because everybody felt like they were on a journey together. But now I think the women's game, and if you look at the Lionesses and what we stand for and what we've spoken out on in the past, it's the nature of the game. It's in the game. There's no women's footballer that wouldn't have an opinion on certain things or be it unapologetically herself. So I just think it's a culture shift, and it's like I say, we've come from having 500 fans in stadiums where they're getting to know people and they're respecting them as humans, whereas we often see Premier League footballers as some sort of aliens, the men.
I wonder whether the patronising attitude has been, this is what the women's game needs to learn from the men's. And I sometimes think it's the other way round. 100%.
There's loads of things where we have things about our game that we really like, and it's not about comparing us. It's two different environments, it's the same sport, but it's definitely different. You can't group them, and I do think that we have things that we would want to protect at all costs because they're better than in men's football.
I want to read you from my family's WhatsApp group, because I wrote to them this morning and said I was interviewing Leah Williamson. My son wrote, "So is Mary Earp signing for Arsenal?"
Good question.
Okay. My daughter said, "Oh my God, tell her I love her."
That's lovely. Thank you so much.
And I said, you can't love someone who plays for Arsenal, but if she wants to. And then my daughter-in-law, who's an Australian, Kate, said, "Why did you spoil the dream of the Matildas?"
Do you know what? That was probably the hardest thing about the World Cup, because we've seen what it did for us last year. I wanted them to do really well. I've got Australian teammates, so my condolences.
It's been an absolute joy speaking to you. Thank you so much.
No, thanks for having me.
Welcome back. Now, Australia has a history of getting through prime ministers quite quickly. I mean, obviously, the UK has overtaken it over the past year with all that has gone on. But one of the most interesting of recent years is Malcolm Turnbull. He was Prime Minister for the Liberal Party, which is broadly the same as the Conservative Party in this country. But he's got some very interesting views on the monarchy, on the future of the Commonwealth, on Donald Trump, and some pretty excoriating views on the impact on public life that Rupert Murdoch has had, who he calls the worst export that's ever come out of Australia. Malcolm Turnbull, you have got a new podcast where it seems to be saying what it does on the tin with a title, Defending Democracy. How much need is democracy in need of defence?
Well, I think it's under attack. And if we cherish it, John, we really do need to defend it. I think and I think our internal threats are the greatest. Populism, authoritarianism, the division and anger in society, best illustrated, or with the most frightening example, I suppose, in the January 6th assault on the US Capitol. It's we can't take our traditional democratic institutions for granted, I'm afraid.
Yes, and I was there in Washington on January the 6th, and it was a terrifying moment. Do you think that was a high watermark, and people have pulled back from that now?
No, I don't. No, I think in the US in particular, the levels of anger and division are as great as they ever were, and you have one half of the House, I suppose, the Republican Party, has been taken over by Donald Trump and his supporters, and it is difficult to see that they, or at least all of them, support democracy in the form that we have grown up to understand it. That is to say, a democracy that is governed by the rule of law.
Yeah, I think you've got one. I think you've got one of your podcast episodes is called "America's Coming Civil War." Do you really think it's as precarious as that?
Well, there are plenty of people that think it could come to that. You know, it is. You see, we're in an environment where a large part of the media, be it social or mainstream, and in the mainstream category, Fox News is by far the most influential example of this, has a business model that is premised on making people angry. And so instead of seeking to find accommodations in the centre, it is about riling people up, portraying your political opponents not as, well-meaning people with whom you differ on political solutions or philosophies, but rather enemies of the state, Satanists, pedophiles, pick your ghastly epithet. You get a business model that's based on that, and then you've got the divisions that we're seeing. I mean, American politics used to be known for the collaboration across the aisle. I mean, certainly from the UK or Australia, where our parliamentary politics has always been, I don't know, a bit like a game of football or
a bit more rough and tumble.
Well, you've had two teams, haven't you? And you've had party discipline has been fairly strong. In the US, traditionally, people from our jurisdictions used to remark on the fact that there was a lot of compromise in the centre, and most people thought that was a good thing.
Look,
polarisation has gone off the charts, and once you start regarding your political opponents as enemies of the state, then you're heading down into very dangerous territory. So, look, let me give you another example. I mean, which European leader do many American self-styled conservatives and many members of the Republican Party and Fox News most highly regard?
Yeah, Viktor Orban, probably.
Viktor Orban.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a guy who has trampled over the judiciaries. He's basically taken over what his friends take over all the media. He runs conspiracy theories. The wildest is against George Soros. And, he's a hero. He's a hero. So
Malcolm, let me read you a headline from the Sydney Morning Herald, and I know you're speaking to us from Sydney, the headline, and it's quoting an interview that you did, comments you made, saying, "Rupert's our deadliest export. Trump's an egomaniac bully," says Turnbull. So, I mean, there you've got two things colliding. The power of Rupert Murdoch and the continuing power of Donald Trump.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Well, Murdoch's has created, or Fox, which is Rupert's creation, I suppose, has created this environment in the United States. I think he's done more damage to the United States than any other individual alive today.
That's quite a statement.
Well, it's a considered statement, and I'm open to debate it. And I mean, when I talk about this with people in the US, most people, on reflection, agree with me. But some would say, well, Trump's actually done more damage. But I think in a sense, they definitely be winner and runner ups. Just maybe you can argue about who's first and who's second. But what Murdoch did with Fox was he demonstrated that you could monetize a media formula which was based on dividing the country and making people angry and fearful and distrustful of each other. Now, in my view, it's hardly an original insight, parliamentary democracy, whether it's in the form we have in the UK or Australia, or what the Americans have, is based on bringing people together in representative institutions to meet in the middle. That's what it's all about. I mean, the best political systems encourage compromise. And what you've now got in the United States is a media ecosystem which is encouraging the reverse, and it's tearing the country apart.
How worried are you about the possibility that Trump wins again in 2024 when he's up against somebody who will be 82, who looks every bit of his 82 years? And, what's the choice?
Well, I mean, the fact that Trump, with, again, backed in by right-wing media, particularly Fox, was able to persuade so many Americans, and certainly an overwhelming majority of Republicans, that he, Donald Trump, had in fact won the 2020 election is incredible. Now, I'm pleased that Murdoch had to write a big check to Dominion Voting Systems in that defamation case, that defamation settlement. But the fact is, what they were spreading was the most consequentially dangerous lie told in American politics in our lifetime, namely that the government was illegitimate, that the presidency had been stolen. Now, when you think about the United States, John, and you reflect on the fact that its foundation story is armed insurrection against illegitimate government, no taxation without representation, throw the bales of tea into Boston Harbor, etc. That's what Americans are brought up to believe was how their country was founded. So you go out there and you persuade, lying to that and persuading a majority of American Republican voters that their president is illegitimate and the election was stolen, and you are surprised that you get an assault on the Capitol. I mean, it follows as night follows day. I mean, this is a country that is armed to the teeth. There are many more guns than there are people in the United States. And you've got a side of politics out there that is basically, and media, making the case that the government is illegitimate. The elections can't be trusted. There's fraud everywhere. It's dynamite, literally.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you a kind of more personal question, which is, what was Donald Trump like to deal with? Because, there was me, kind of the BBC's North America editor, trying to make sense of the Trump presidency. And frankly, Malcolm Turnbull, you helped enormously because of that conversation that you had, which became public.
Yes, well, someone in the White House briefed it out. We're not entirely sure why. We think it was because Trump or his people wanted it to be known that although he had agreed to continue with the refugee transfer deal that I'd done with Obama, he'd done so most unwillingly. In any event, look, Trump, I had not ever dealt with Trump before I was PM and he was president, but we had a lot of friends in common and business associates in common. He was a familiar type of personality to me. I'd worked with with a lot of big, larger than life, egocentric billionaires, whether Conrad Black, Kerry Packer, Rupert Murdoch, not that, Murdoch's actually, as personality-wise, relatively low-key. Jimmy Goldsmith, there's a long list. So I'd seen that type before. And the one thing that I knew was that if you suck up to characters like that, they just want more sucking up. So it was fortunate that our first substantive exchange was one where I by force of circumstance, stood up to him, and the conversation started off with him saying, "No way, Jose," effectively, and ended up saying, "Yes, but I hate you." So anyway, we got to the right outcome. That certainly won his respect, and after that, the relationship worked quite well. But it was, and I had quite a bit of success with him on matters of trade, but I found him an intelligent counterparty and he is an intelligent man, and he's got incredible communication skills, but that doesn't mean he's a good man. Just because somebody is clever doesn't mean they're good, or intelligent doesn't mean they're good. And he is what he has done, what he sought to do, was essentially overthrow the constitution of his own country. That's what he's been charged with. But that whole business with January 6th was mind-blowing. If you had written, I can't tell you how many friends of mine in the movie business I've said, if you'd been presented with a script 5 years ago along these lines, what would you have said? And they all said, oh, well, just too wild, too wild. So it's, there's nothing in the West Wing that remotely approaches it. So it is, Trump is a major destabilising force, and he's a destabilising force in two ways. Firstly, he's destabilising in the United States. He wins by dividing the country against itself. America is the sheet anchor of the democratic world. If America is divided, then all of us, UK, Europeans, Japan, Australia, all of us are disadvantaged. But the second thing, of course, is that he prefers dictators. I've seen him with Putin. He loved Putin. It was like a bromance. He loves Erdogan. He wanted to be best friends with Xi Jinping. He prefers authoritarians. And of course, he threatened to pull out of NATO. A lot of people think if he comes back, he will. Does anyone imagine that he won't cut a deal with Putin at Ukraine's expense if he becomes president? Does anyone imagine that Putin isn't hanging in there just to wait to see if Trump gets back? These are incredibly high stakes at the moment, John. I know this all sounds terribly negative and almost apocalyptic, and a lot of Americans, I think a lot of people around the world, tend to just switch off and say, it's just too awful to contemplate. But it's real. He could win.
Sure. Of course.
Biden's very old. And look, truthfully, in a two-horse race, either horse can win.
Absolutely.
In politics, either candidate can win. Look how close Jeremy Corbyn came in your country. So,
yep.
First time round. So you've got to, you just got to be realistic. Say he'll certainly get nominated by the Republicans, and if that happens, then he's a chance. Whether it's 40% or 45%, I don't know, but he's a real chance.
So what about China? You just mentioned Xi Jinping there, and you have talked recently about the kind of growing influence. We've got the British Foreign Secretary in China at the moment for talks, and you get a sense that maybe the British government feels the pendulum swung too far back in a kind of hostile, China skeptic, xenophobic way, and they now want to redress that. Are there dangers there?
Well, you've got the way to deal with China, and when we're talking about China, we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. Okay. When you're dealing with the Communist Party, it is a Leninist system. Its mission, its focus is to preserve absolute power. That is that's what it's all about. So they respect strength, they respect power, they respect resolve. If they seek to bully you, you have to stand up to them. Now, obviously, in some circumstances, people and countries are unable to do that. But the reason you are seeing Xi Jinping on what is effectively a charm offensive at the moment is because several years of wolf warrior diplomacy and bullying and attempted coercion, including of my country, Australia, has failed. So there now, there is a reset going on in China. But I think the only way to deal with Xi Jinping is to be absolutely frank, be clear about the areas where you're happy to cooperate and the areas where you are not, and recognise that there are, in the relationship with China, as there are in most relationships, there are in effect boundaries of trust. There are things you would tell your wife or your husband that you wouldn't tell your work colleagues. There's things you tell your work colleagues you wouldn't tell someone you meet on the bus. So you've got to work out what is the rules of engagement you want to have with China, and then abide by those.
There's one other area of democracy I want to talk to you about, and you say it's preserving and defending democracy, your podcast series. That's the British royal family. Should it continue to have a place in Australian public life? Is the days of Australia as a republic long overdue?
Oh, they're absolutely long overdue. I agree with that. Look, I have a high regard for Charles and Camilla, in fact, and I have and like everyone, I had very high regard for the Queen. But Australia's head of state should be an Australian citizen, and we came close to amending our constitution to do that in 1999. I expect there'll be another referendum, in the next few years on the republic. We'll see how it goes. Our constitution is very hard to change, but clearly the British monarchy in Australia is an anachronism. I mean, if you look at it this way, John, when the Australian colonies became the Commonwealth of Australia, the Federation, which is this we call Australia, the political federation, the Queen, Victoria, referred to in our constitution repeatedly, was effectively the British government. The Governor-General was appointed by the British government. Discretions that were vested in the Queen were vested in the British government. Australia was not, in 1901, an independent country, nor did it seek to be. Australians saw themselves, as for the most part, as being as British as anyone in the British Isles. And even when Australia had become politically independent, say by mid-century, many Australians still saw themselves as British. I mean, Menzies in 1953 said, "The crown is the symbol that wherever we are in the world, we are one people, one British people." He said around the same time, the boundaries of Britain are not on the Kentish coast, but at Invercargill and Cape York. Invercargill, not in Scotland, at the southern tip of New Zealand. So now, no one in Australia would call themselves British unless they actually were British. And so the problem is the monarchy, 120 years ago represented the reality of superior British power. In mid-century, it represented a shared British identity. Now, what does it represent? It doesn't make it, and it's an anachronism.
So stick your neck out. When does Australia become a republic? How many years? Within your lifetime?
John, what within my lifetime? Well, I hope so. But ask not for whom the bell tolls, etc. Look, I would think the next referendum will come up within 3 to 5 years. We have a referendum coming up in 6 weeks, in fact, on the question of whether there should be in the Constitution a what's called the Indigenous voice, which is to say a committee composed of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians for the purpose of giving advice on matters affecting them to Parliament and government. So I think that referendum will be voted on in 6 weeks, and regardless of its outcome, then the next issue of constitutional change will be the republic.
And if you vote to become a republic, as you hope, is there any future for the Commonwealth? I mean, it's a microcosm.
Yes, honestly.
No, let me just finish the question. You see the Commonwealth Games. No one wants to host the Commonwealth Games anymore. It's like the idea of it itself seems to have become a bit more anachronistic and kind of dated in historical terms, and no one's interested in it today.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, I think right. Well, the first thing is most countries in the Commonwealth are republics now, and including the biggest ones, and indeed by far the biggest one, India. So I think 2/3 of the countries in the Commonwealth are republics, and most of the ones that are not are small island nations in the Caribbean or the Pacific. So there's no problem with being a republic and being in the Commonwealth. That isn't remotely an issue. Look, the Commonwealth Games, I think the real problem is there isn't the international media interest in it. I think it's essentially a commercial decision that people are making, that they don't see how they can make it pay its way. How effective is the Commonwealth from a diplomatic point of view? Well, views differ, but countries have joined the Commonwealth. I mean, Rwanda, for example, had no history of being part of the British Empire and chose to join the Commonwealth. I think people might question how much good it does, but I don't think it does any harm. There was quite a strong discussion, a genuine, substantive discussion between Commonwealth countries back in 2018 at the last CHOGM I attended, which was in London, as to whether Prince Charles, as he then was, should be formally recognised as the next head of the Commonwealth after the Queen. And it was very clear, the decision was that he should be, but it was made very clear this was not because he was the son of Elizabeth, but rather because of his personal qualities. So, I think the British monarchy, whether the next generation of British royals will be head of the Commonwealth, I would say is an open question, because, there are a lot of Commonwealth countries that have, for very, very good reason, at best mixed views and very often extremely negative views about their association, with Great Britain. I mean, all of the countries that were colonised and plundered and looted and, had their citizens, taken in slave ships and, worked to death on sugar plantations. It's not, you saw the reaction to the current Prince of Wales.
Yeah.
And Catherine in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And
and it was hostile.
Well, yeah, and I mean, you don't have to be dripping with empathy to understand why. So it's there's a tendency, I think, for people to imagine that the British Empire was everywhere a force for good, and what a wonderful job it did around the world. Well, that's an argument, I suppose, but you can't expect everybody, particularly in the countries that were colonised or expropriated or occupied or invaded, to take the same view. So the British connection is not perhaps as compelling as it might once have been.
Yeah. And just a final thought. I mean, we're talking about change and fundamental change. Do we need to change the laws of Test cricket so that you don't get a jammy draw for Australia in the Test match series, which would, of course, allowed England to win the series?
Well, you have forgotten vastly more about cricket than I would have ever known. So I will let that ball go straight through to the keeper.
Malcolm Turnbull, great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. And that's it from us for today. Lewis will be here tomorrow, and the young Tyro will be hearing from the old Tyro, David Dimbleby.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.